Welcome to another meetup of Frontend RheinMain. The countdown music was Miami Midnight Drive by computer music artist Chris Hulsbeck. So if you grew up during the era of the Amiga or C64 home computers in the 80s or early 90s, you might remember its game and the soundtrack, like the soundtrack of this game I'm showing here. And he was contributing with famous music to this game. And it's Chris Hülsbeck. Check out his homepage, hülsbeck.com. He really does amazing stuff. And as today's meetup could also be titled Back to the Future, so to say, we thought this fits quite nice. So today, we are super happy to welcome Carson Gross from Montana in the US to connect with us from Wiesbaden in Germany. And we are curious from where do you join our live stream now? Write it in the chat, right? We're really super curious about. And if you want to find more about us, please go to frontendrheinmain.de or click the links in the video description. Carson invented HTMx, which gives you access to Ajax, CSS transitions, WebSockets, and server-send events directly in HTML using attributes. Showing some funny memes during my talking. HTMx is small, dependency-free, extendable, IE11 compatible, and has reduced code base sizes by 67% when compared with React. I just discovered it this year, and after reading through his ebook about hypermedia systems, I got hooked pretty much. So why not let himself provide a first-hand overview on hypermedia with HTMx? Welcome, Carson.
How's it going? Thanks very much, Dan. I appreciate that. Glad to be here. It was pretty close. We touched down about 10 minutes ago, and I sprinted around the airport and found a spot I could actually do this talk in. So if there's background noise, I apologize. It's been a rough 24 hours. Delta canceled or delayed a flight by 12 hours and kind of stuck me in a hotel for 3 hours last night. So I'm a little I'm not necessarily in peak shape right now, but I'll try my best to explain what HTMx is and how it can be useful. So.
Cool. I can't appreciate much, right? How I like it that you, under the circumstances, made it and like sitting at the airport giving this presentation now in time arrived. That's why we had a small delay in with the live stream starting, but all is good. You are here now, and hopefully the background noise is fine. You might turn up your volume maybe in the audience when Carson is maybe a bit more silent due to the noise. I think, maybe it's just some short housekeeping, so to say.
Sure.
Carson will like give a talk for like 30 to probably 40 minutes roughly, and you can write all the comments, questions in the chat already, and we will pick them up later. So I think we'll have time for 15, 20 minutes for sure. Depends on the questions and comments, and so there's room for that as well. And yeah, I would say the stage is yours.
Okay.
Enjoy, and
sure.
Let's go.
Right, let's go. So the talk I'm going to give today is going to be on hypermedia, and what I'm going to try and do. So I assume the audience has some familiarity. You don't need a ton of familiarity with HTMx, but I'm going to explain to you how, if you look at HTML and understand HTML as a hypermedia, how that can be generalized, and then how HTMx generalizes it. And then we're going to look at some practical examples of things that you can build with that generalization. So we'll run through some examples, and I'll just go into the details of how each one of them works and how we're using this hypermedia model that was sort of, I'd say, the original model of the web, and how that can drive more sophisticated user experiences than most developers probably think is possible today. Hopefully that'll change over time. So let me kick over to my slides, and I'm gonna do this. Can I do this? I need two monitors. I'll just do it in one. So I'll kind of bounce back and forth. So there might be some weird pauses as I do that, but I'm on a laptop in an airport. So this is the talk, Hypermedia Reconsidered. And just to give a quick background on me, my name is Carson Gross. I have a software company that's just me. There's someone else that works for it. Out of Bozeman, Montana. I've been up here for 4 years now, and I work at a university. I teach in the computer science department. My primary software that I make with my open source with this company, besides doing some consulting, is HTMx, which I think probably everyone here has heard of. You can find out more about it at htmx.org. There are some other things that I've done. So hyperscript.org is a scripting language for the web. That's kind of a passion project of mine. And then there's grugbrain.dev, which is kind of a funny blog about the stuff that I've learned in the 20 plus years that I've been programming. And then we have a new book coming out. I'm hoping to be able to release it next week, actually, in hardcover. But you can read it online for free now at hypermedia.systems. We'll have an actual hardcover, a nice book available for sale on Amazon next week, as well as an ebook, I believe. But you can read it online for free as well if you want to take a look at what that's all about. That's me. HTMx is the most popular library that I've been able to turn out, and it's what I call a hypermedia-oriented front-end library, which means it focuses on hypermedia rather than what a lot of the SPA single-page application frameworks do, which is they sort of do their own thing. They have their in-memory model that then reactively drives the user interface. Well, HTMx doesn't do that. Instead, it tries to augment HTML as a hypermedia. Augment it as a hypermedia. Now, HTMx isn't the only one. There's lots of other good hypermedia-oriented libraries out there. So, for example, unpoly.com, which is out of Germany, I believe, and hotwire.dev, which is from the 37 Signals, the Ruby on Rails people, and then intercooler.js, which was actually the previous iteration of HTMx. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at all those. They all have their different kind of take on how things should work. And they may or may not fit your needs better than HTMx does. But I do want to say that I think HTMx is probably the purest hypermedia. It's the most hypermedia focused of them, in that it really just builds like a small layer, or not a small layer, but it builds up from on top of HTML instead of giving you other concepts. So another concept that you might find for example, unpoly is a notion of layers, which is sort of a way to structure modal windows on top of one another. And that's a very useful abstraction, but it's not something that's sort of baked into HTML, so HTMx forgoes that. And so depending on what level you want to work at, HTMx is probably going to be more work to achieve certain UI patterns, but it's closer to the metal, if you want to think of it that way. But again, I want to encourage everyone to go and check out all those options as far as what they might find the most useful for their own work. Because HTMx is so focused on hypermedia, I want to talk about what a hypermedia is. And my understanding is that this is kind of a mix of younger developers and older developers. The older developers might have a pretty good sense of what hypermedia is, but the younger developers might not. A lot of younger web developers, unfortunately, have not really didn't learn about the web. When they came of age technologically, React was already the thing, and so you do everything reactively. You never learn the fundamentals of what hypermedia is, what a link really is. You probably pick it up along the way, but you don't get that deep understanding of what hypermedia is when compared with earlier on in web development, when that was all there. So the question is, what is a hypermedia? And a hypermedia is just a media, so a text, for example, that has hypermedia controls within it. And really, the presence of hypermedia controls is the crucial thing that differentiates between media and hypermedia. And so right here, we've got a little bit of we've got a simple web page with HTML and a body in it, and it's got an anchor tag in it. This A stands for anchor. And this anchor has an href, and that stands for hypermedia reference. And so this is an example, this is a canonical example, I would say, of a hypermedia control. And this hypermedia control allows nonlinear branching within a document. So this early on, hypermedia had this very document-oriented it came out of the documents world. It was invented in order to allow navigation between research documents. So there wasn't so much mutation as there was navigation, but it was non-linear. So in contrast with books or reading a single paper or something like that, you could jump around by clicking on links. And so that's what made things a hypermedia. And the anchor was sort of the original hypermedia control in that regard. I believe it was in HTML2, maybe 3, I always forget. The form element was added to HTML. And when that happened, the hypermedia architecture switched. It was a pretty big jump, actually. It went from a read-only sort of document-oriented system to a system that you could actually build real applications in, because now you had the ability to update, not just consume, not just read things, but also update them. And so that turned hypermedia from an interesting document-oriented architecture into a full-fledged application architecture. So forms allow you to issue posts as well as gets. You can also issue gets with them as well, but post was how you mutated things. And sorry, there's going to be an announcement here. What's interesting to me, or one thing that as I got more mature in my understanding of hypermedia, is that really there's only two hypermedia controls, or two main hypermedia controls available in HTML. You have anchor tags and forms, and with only those two hypermedia controls, somehow we built like all of Web 1.0. And that was pretty big. It was a big deal. A lot of stuff happened in Web 1.0. I know it's hard to remember now, but there was just a huge number of web applications that were very profitable. Some still, Amazon came out of that era. It's obviously a much more sophisticated front end now, but really with just these two things, the internet was able to pretty much dominate application development for a couple of decades. So I think it's a testament to the power of the hypermedia model that even with those two things and with the problems associated with them, which we'll discuss in a moment, we were able to build a huge amount of functionality and do all the crazy Web 1.0 stuff that we were able to. So it's very, very impressive to me. But obviously that way of building things, to an extent, at least in the thought leader world, at least in Twitter and what you see online, it isn't nearly as discussed these days when contrasted with, for example, React or Vue or Svelte, or however you say that, and so forth, where those have a lot more mind share. And a lot of people don't even really think very much about hypermedia at all, and certainly don't discuss it very much. Now, a big part of that is that HTML hasn't significantly been updated as a hypermedia. Certainly gotten lots of new features, but as a hypermedia, it really hasn't advanced very much in the last 20 years. And so it's been sitting there kind of doing nothing, and the rest of the web development community has moved on from it because of that. And a big part of that, I think, is the interactivity problems that you have with standard anchor tags and standard forms. So these older web applications, some of you might work on these, they're sometimes called Web 1.0 applications. A problem with them is that they have this big flash. Like when you make a transition, or when you click on a link, or when you submit a form, it refreshes the whole page. And so there's a clunky feel to it. Browsers have gotten better at it, but they haven't been able to erase that sort of feel of, this doesn't feel like, for example, a thick client might feel, where there isn't this awkward sort of refresh of the entire page. And in my opinion, is what really drove a lot of people over to the single page application, to the JavaScript heavy ways of building applications, is they really wanted to avoid that. So it's unfortunate that HTML has not made very much progress. There are some ways, there's a way, or the underlying thesis, I would say, of HTMx is we can actually fix that. And in order to fix that, what we're going to need to think about is how can we generalize hypermedia? How can we generalize this concept of hypermedia controls in particular, since that's the crux of what a hypermedia is. And so to do that, let's take a kind of an in-depth, close look at what this anchor tag really means. So what it means is that what this code, and I think it is code, maybe it's not a programming language, but it is code. What it tells a browser or a hypermedia client is, hey, I want you to render some text. And when a user clicks on that text, when a user clicks, so that's one thing, clicks on that text, so on a thing, like on this thing, issue an HTTP GET to about. So there's a network request that's driven by that click on this thing. And then I want you to take the hypermedia response that you receive from that, and I want you to replace the entire screen. I want you to replace the entire screen. And so I think those are the four fundamental aspects of hypermedia control as hypermedia controls. So then our opportunity is going to be generalizing those aspects. How can we generalize each of them? So the first thing, we'll start with number 2, actually, because that's just a little bit more logical. On this link, well, how come only links are able to, links and forms really, are able to issue HTTP requests? That doesn't seem like a necessary constraint. Now, there are accessibility issues. I'm happy to discuss that afterwards, but nonetheless, it seems somewhat arbitrary that only anchor tags and forms can issue HTTP requests. At the very least, it seems like buttons should be able to do so, and I think there's strong arguments, and I'll show some demos of examples of even non-interactive elements, like a div, for example. I think there's at least one good example when a div issuing a request is actually a good thing. So let's generalize that. What if it was possible for any HTML element to be a hypermedia control? The second thing is when a user clicks. So the second thing we're going to examine was the first item opportunity that we mentioned, which is a click occurs. So clicks are an event, submits are an event, that's fine, but there's lots of events that are issued by the DOM and the DOM bubbling model and all that sort of stuff. What's so special about clicks and what's so special about submits? What if we generalized that and made it possible for any event that the DOM generates or that we generate with our own JavaScript? What if we made it possible for them to issue a request based on any event? And then our third opportunity is, okay, issue an HTTP get to about. What if it's possible to issue any type of requests? So if you're familiar with HTTP, there's more than just get and post. It's somewhat crazy, but in 2023, in standard HTML, it's only possible to issue gets and posts according to the HTML spec from HTML, and that seems dumb. HTTP, after all, was designed to transfer the hypertext markup language. So how come it can't access those other types of requests, puts, deletes, patches, and so forth? And so that's an opportunity for HTMx to generalize what HTML already gives you and to give you access to those types of requests as well. And then the fourth one, and this is really the big one, I think, because it really goes at the heart of the interactivity problem that you have with most hypermedia-driven applications, early Web 1.0 hypermedia-driven applications, is why do we have to replace the whole screen? What if we were able to replace any element on the screen? And once you do that, once you break with that idea that we have to refresh the whole page with this hypermedia request, it really lets you, it opens up a huge, very large space of features that you can build using pure hypermedia exchanges in a way that doesn't feel clunky and that doesn't have that flash of unstyled content and so forth. So I think this goes at the heart of why JavaScript heavy approaches to web development won. It was that the ability to not have that clunky feel when you're creating an application. So these are our four potential generalizations, and these are the four generalizations of HTMx. Make it possible for any element to issue any element to be a hypermedia control, any event to trigger a particular request. Any type of request can be made, and then we can take the HTML that's the response from that request, which will be in a hypermedia format, and we'll be able to put it anywhere on the screen. So those are the four generalizations of HTMx. And here we have a button that's being driven by HTMx, and you can see it has some attributes on it. So HTMx tries as much as possible, and I'm a flawed developer, so I've screwed some syntax up, but I think it's pretty good. As much as possible tries to be attribute driven, just like an anchor has an href, a hypermedia reference on it. So HTMx tries to follow that example, and in general tries to follow HTML's example as closely as possible. And so here we have a button, and this button is a hypermedia control, and it's a hypermedia control because you put hx put on it, which says, okay, I want you to issue an HTTP put to the /like page. And that makes sense for a like, because that's something that you want to do once, and so that's a good HTTP action for that. So that makes it that's what turns this into a hypermedia control. And this is the general flavor of HTMx. You put attributes into your HTML rather than writing a bunch of JavaScript to do things. So HTMx has a bunch of different versions of this sort of this is one of the most important attributes in HTMx. It has hx put, hx get, hx post, so forth, that let you issue different types of requests. So this makes it possible for any element to become a hypermedia control in your hypermedia driven application, and then they can issue any type of request that they'd like. So it really addresses those two potential generalization opportunities that we have. The next attribute down is hx trigger, and this obviously I hope is pretty obvious to everyone who's watching that. One thing I strive for in HTMx is to make things pretty obvious, so even if you've never written a line of HTMx, you can figure out what's going on. And so this hx trigger makes it possible for any event. Here we're responding to click, but we could respond to mouse over or key up or whatever. We'll look at some examples where we do respond to different events. I don't think mouse over is a good idea with a button, but you could do it if you wanted to. All right, and the hx trigger attribute is what allows you to specify this is the event that's going to trigger a hypermedia exchange with a server, so that addresses that opportunity for generalization of HTML. And it's a little redundant here, actually, I should say, because by default for a button, the default trigger is going to be click. So we could omit this attribute in this example, but just showing it for pedagogical purposes. And then the last attribute on here is and this is again that really important thing. Here we have an hx target, and it has a CSS selector. So again, we're trying to reuse existing HTML concepts. So CSS selectors are obviously a big part of HTML, and so we allow you to target whatever thing you want on the page using a CSS selector. And so this says essentially issue a put request to like when a click occurs, and then whatever HTML comes back, I want you to put that into the thing with the ID output, which is this output element down below. So it's going to take the HTML that comes back from that and stick it into the inner HTML of this output. And that could be thank you for liking, it could be a heart, whatever, it could be a bunch of different stuff. But whatever that is, it's going to be HTML. You're not going to do JSON template, server or client side, I should say, template processing. You're just going to take whatever HTML came back and you're going to insert it into the document. So that's a total of 7 attributes that address all of those generalizations that we discussed. And so not a ton of attributes, not a ton of code. And that's kind of the point, is it's a relatively simple model because it's building on the existing infrastructure of the web. Now there's a few more attributes. For example, hx swap would allow you, if you wanted to use an hx swap attribute, you can specify exactly how the new content is swapped in. Do you want it to be the inner HTML? Do you want to target the outer HTML? Do you want to append it, and so forth? Hx indicator is an attribute that allows you to show an indicator when a request is in flight, so that users have feedback that something's occurring. That's often very good to do from a usability standpoint. HX include allows you to include inputs. By default, if there's a form wrapping around an element, it'll include it, but HX include lets you do that a little bit more dynamically. HX select allows you to select a chunk from the returned HTML. So if you only want some bit from within a larger document, you can select just that out to be swapped into the DOM. So roughly, I'd say there's about a dozen or so core attributes to the library. You can check out htmx.org/reference if you want to see them all, as well as all the events and so forth that HTMX triggers. Pretty rich environment, but not the core of it is very small. At the end of the day, you can probably get your head around HTMX, I'd say, in a day or so if you have some HTML/web development experience. So that's great, pretty small. But the question is, okay, we've generalized hypermedia, maybe. What can we accomplish with that? None of this is an interesting intellectual exercise, but what can we actually accomplish with it? And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to go through the examples and just show you sort of HTMX in action. Let me blow this up so you can see what's going on here. I just want to show you HTMX in action. Nope, I'm going to dismiss that. And let me kick over really quick and make sure, can everybody see this? Can everyone see this? Good. I just want to make sure that we're good here before I keep going.
I think it looks good. Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, sweet. So this is, I've got, if you go to htmx.org, I've got a lot of the /examples page. I've got a lot of examples there of just, here's a thing you can do with HTMX. And they're not components or anything like that. Rather, they're just sort of examples, like copy and pastable examples, or, you know, like just to give you some ideas of what can we accomplish with these tools. And so here we have a div that's targeting itself, the outer HTML of itself. And we've got a button in here that's going to get from the contact/1/edit URL a form to edit this contact. So Joe Blow, which is kind of an Americanism, but whatever. So this is a really bad contact app where we've got kind of some divs showing some information and then the ability to edit it. And so what this is going to do is when you click on this button, it's going to issue a get to this. It's going to get back a form, and then it's going to swap that form in for this div, but it's going to do it all in line. Now that form is going to have an HX put on it, which makes sense because this is an update. So we're going to put the contact/1. It's going to target itself. It's going to replace the outer HTML of itself. It's probably going to replace itself with something like that. So, but we also have a cancel button in here, which rather than issuing a put, so this is going to be triggered by a submit by default since this is a form. But rather than doing that, this button is going to say, hey, just issue a get to that and get the current state of the contact rather than trying to update it. And so, so a little bit of HTML, not too much, but with that, we can come down here and you can see a working example. We can say, Joey, here, let's do something a little more realistic. Joey, and I can submit it and it updates. Or I can click cancel and it doesn't. Click the edit. Cancel, and it doesn't, and it's driving hypermedia exchanges. So if you click here, you can see, okay, we had a get, we got back the form replaced this. So when I clicked here, right, the form replaced that, and then when I clicked another button, it got back some more HTML and replaced that form. So it was all hypermedia exchanges. There was no JSON here. And okay, cool. I mean, HTML has had forms forever. Why is that a big deal? Well, note that the scroll state of this page has not changed, right? I'm working with this HTML. I'm clicking cancel. Again, I apologize for the crappy styling. I wanted to keep it pretty pure without any fancy pants styling, just so you could see what was going on. But we're able to keep the scroll state here. So you can have this edit anywhere. You could have it down at the bottom of some page. You don't have that giant chunk where you lose all your mental state, and you can actually see what's going on. You stay in one place. And so this is just a simple example of how HTMX can take a fairly common pattern, a form that edits some information, and make it smoother than it is using the standard HTML model. All right. So that's one example of HTMX in action. Another example, and this is an example where the div, people sometimes will complain like, oh, you shouldn't have, divs should never issue a request because you should use a button or whatever. Well, I don't agree with that necessarily, and this is a good example of where I don't think that's true. This div issues a get to the /graph URL, and it does so on the load event, and this is a synthetic event that HTMX triggers. And what this does effectively is it makes this div lazily loaded. So this div will render, and then it will issue a new request to get its actual content. And in this case, the graph is expensive to calculate, and so it takes a little bit. And so I'm going to come down here, I'm going to hit refresh so you can kind of see. So it starts with this indicator as it's making that request, and then when that graph finishes rendering, it at that point swaps it into the screen. And it's using the load trigger in order to do that. So this is saying, okay, render this dev with an image, which is kind of a spinner SVG that shows like, hey, something's happening. And when this finishes, load whatever the HTML response is from this URL into this div. So, okay, why would you want to do that? Well, if this is super expensive to compute, you might want the rest of the page to render. And I'm thinking of applications where you click on something and there's an expensive computation and it takes a while to get the UI. And maybe you're not interested in that expensive computation. Maybe that expensive computation isn't going to block you from doing what you want to do. There's another, you might further navigate or something like that. And so this takes the generation of that graph out of the critical path of rendering the rest of the UI. So you can use lazy loading, just 2 attributes. You can lazy load anything, any HTML content, and you can use that actually as a performance optimization, a perceived performance optimization. Obviously, it's a trade-off because it's a little bit more complicated. And you have multiple requests now, but it'll get that first page render very fast. Like they'll be able to see what's going on really quickly and interact with it. And maybe, you know, this graph isn't super important to the user. So that's an example, I think, of a situation where a div is an effective hypermedia control, even though it's not, you know, we're not using it as a button or something like that. So that's lazy loading. The next example I wanted to talk about was sortable. And sortable, what this example shows is how HTMx can interact with more complicated JavaScript code. So sortable.js is a JavaScript library that allows you to do drag and drop. And so that's the kind of thing that typically, you know, people are like, oh, how could you do drag and drop in a hypermedia application? Well, yeah, you know, you do have to do some client-side scripting for sure. But I've written some code here. There's some code written here that hooks up so that anything with the sortable class on it gets initialized with this sortable.js library. And that makes it drag and droppable. And then the integration with HTMx is done by having a form that is marked as sortable so that the divs within it are going to be draggable and droppable. It integrates with that with the sortable.js library via events. So sortable.js triggers an end event when it's done doing a drag and drop. And so we can listen for that event. And when a drag and drop finishes, we can use that to trigger a hypermedia exchange with the server. And so here we trigger a post to the /items URL, and that should persist, you know, whatever the new ordering is. We're using a hidden input here to keep track of the ordering as we drag things around. And if we come down here, you can see as I drag things around, it's very fast. You can see there's a quick flash of an indicator up here saying, oh, it's updating. And if we look at the posts, you can see every time we finish a drag and drop, a post is issued with the order, the new order of these elements. And so here we've got a very rich user experience. I mean, sort of a simple, rich user experience, but still, nonetheless, you can imagine this being useful for dragging and dropping tasks or whatever it is. And we've integrated it with HTMx and with the hypermedia model by using events. And so this is something I'll say very often. I think when you've got, sometimes you'll hear the term island of interactivity, and people say, oh, you should use React or whatever for that. And that's fine. You know, hypermedia is a tool. It's not always applicable. Sometimes you need heavier tools in order to achieve what you want, like here, where we're trying to make drag and drop work. And that's great. And the way to integrate that island of interactivity with a broader hypermedia application, in my opinion, is to use events. And so hopefully those, either if you're building the thing yourself, you can trigger an event, or if you're using a library like sortable.js, it triggers events. You can use that to hook into a broader hypermedia application quite easily that's built with HTMx. So I think that's a good example that answers some of the people who say, well, what about, right? Like, what about this super complicated thing? Fine, do it using whatever you want. It's all good. But just trigger events, and then you can integrate that thing into a broader hypermedia application, which is, you know, obviously still very simple, has that simple original model of the web. And then the final one that I want to show, just because it's kind of the granddaddy of them, I think it's the coolest one of them all, is something called active search. And active search takes, as you're typing into an input, the search results filter down. And so to do that, this is a little more complicated. It's definitely a little bit more advanced HTMx, but it's not crazy. Hopefully you can understand it, even if this is your first time looking at HTMx. So we've got an input. It's of type search. And it's going to do a post to the /search URL. This should probably be a get. I need to rework this example, but it's a post for now. It's fine. It's all good. So it's going to issue a post to search. fine, the input's going to do that. And it's going to do so, and the trigger here is a little more sophisticated than some of the other stuff we've seen. So it's going to do it on the key up event. Now, obviously, you don't want to do it on every key up event. So if there are arrow keys that are pressed, you don't want to issue any requests to your server. And so there's some modifiers. So this changed modifier says only issue a request if the thing that this is defined on has changed, if its value has changed since the last time. And then the other modifier here is delay 500 milliseconds. And this does something called debouncing. So obviously it would be bad form to, on every single keystroke, to issue a server request. And so what this does is it says, okay, when a key up occurs, wait 500 milliseconds. And if another key up occurs, cancel that previous one. Wait until there's basically a 500 millisecond pause so that we're not hammering on our server. And that general concept in UI and in engineering is called debouncing. So this debounces the requests to that input. And then finally, there's a comma, which indicates more than one event is going to trigger a request. And in this case, the search event is also going to trigger it. So if you have a search input, some browsers will render a little X in it. And so when that gets clicked on, there's no key up event, but there is a search event that's triggered. So a little bit complicated, but not crazy, I hope. You know, you can get your head around that, and you could read the docs and figure it out pretty quickly. The next attribute that's important on here is the target. And here we're going to say, what we're saying is take the post response, the response from the post to this URL, and stick it into the search results, the thing with the ID search dash results. Again, using a CSS selector. And so if we look down a little bit further, that's the T body of this table that's located below this input. And then finally, there's an HX indicator, which says, hey, I want to use the thing with the class HTMx-indicator to indicate that a search is occurring so that people know that something's happening. And so here's the demo for that, excuse me. And if I type A and I wait a second, you can see there's a request that goes out, and that request came back with some results, and those results were put into this table below. And if I continue to filter that, if I type E, for example, it filters it down a little bit more. And if I type S, it filters it down even more until I'm looking at what the only people that have AES either in their emails or names or whatever. And you can see that HTMx was issuing these posts to the search URLs as we went, and it was taking the results and just slamming them basically into that T body down below the table. And so very simple, you know, hypermedia exchange, nothing fancy. I hope everyone here can imagine how they might construct server-side code in order to render the table body here appropriately. But nonetheless, you have what I consider a pretty, you know, this is a pretty neat piece of UX that certainly there's a lot of web apps or web applications, even single-page applications, where I kind of wish they had this. And you were able to achieve that writing only, you know, 4 attributes. You know, a little bit hairier than some of the other stuff that we've seen, but nonetheless, this isn't crazy code. And compare and contrast, for example, with the React code that would be necessary to make this happen, right? So I think this is a good example, and I like finishing on this one because it's a really good example of just how interactive your hypermedia-driven applications can be if you do a little bit of expansive thinking about what can I do with this tool? What can I do with this tool? And what sort of experiences can I provide? This is something that I think most web developers would assume, you know, requires a fair amount of JavaScript in order to pull something like this off. And in fact, it's just some attributes on HTML. So pretty cool. Okay. So I'm going to claim that that's a pretty high power to weight ratio. And I'm going to claim that hypermedia is a pretty interesting concept. And so hopefully my hope is that HTMx as a hypermedia-oriented library sort of sparks, and I think we're starting to see that, interest in particularly younger web developers in the hypermedia model and what can be achieved using it. These concepts have fallen on hard times, but I think there's a sense that maybe React has gotten a little crazy in some cases and maybe isn't necessary, and people are searching for more simple solutions to web development, and I think hypermedia can provide that for you. So I'm a hypermedia enthusiast, and there are other hypermedia enthusiasts out there, in particular web browsers. Web browsers are really good at downloading, parsing, and rendering hypermedia. And so maybe we should take advantage of that fact. Maybe we should take advantage of the fact that these tools have a bunch of infrastructure baked into them. The amazing clients that we've got in web browsers, maybe we should take a little more advantage of the hypermedia functionality that they have in them. So that's my talk. That's my talk. Q&A. Oh, I can't hear you. Are you muted or am I muted?
I was muted. Now you hear me, right?
Sweet. Here,
Thank you.
I'll mute so you don't have to listen to the kids screaming in the background.
No, the noise was totally fine. I think you were pretty good, understandable, and yeah, it was a great session. Thank you for that. I'm again hooked by it. So yeah, round of applause. I see in the audience. We have now time for questions, comments. Please write it in the chat.
Yeah.
For me, maybe I can start with what my impression was. Like I started with web development at the end of the 90s when there wasn't much JavaScript. Then 10 years later, 5 years later, like after the HTML time, so to say, jQuery became a thing, right?
Yep.
Then the rise of SPA started. I did Angular stuff. Recently, I got hooked by Svelte quite a lot.
Yeah.
And then I found out HTMx, and I thought, whoa, this is. It seems like it's closing a big gap, right? Where I felt we as developers got maybe like too much, how to say, like sucked onto some hype train thingy with the big JavaScript frameworks and
Yep.
put way too much stuff to the client for things which, as you made it also clear to me when I read through the ebook, was or is already there by the architecture with REST and Hypermedia in general, right?
Yeah.
For me, that's why I thought of like, okay, back to the future, so to say, right? It's and I like the simplicity. I must really say, like, the what you can achieve with that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there was a little bit of like, you have to use React to be a serious person, right? Like you have to use React to be a serious developer. And if you go to grugbrain.dev, there's a section called Fear of Looking Dumb. And I think one thing that we have in our industry is everyone is scared of not being considered intelligent because it's really bad for your career. People are like, no, my guy's not sharp enough. You're not going to get hired. You're not going to be taken seriously in technical decisions. And so it's hard to advocate for a simpler technology. And there are compromises. Hypermedia isn't perfect. It can't address every technical need out there. So you're always going to have a what about. It's going to be, okay, well, yeah, it just doesn't handle that. And so you have to be comfortable saying, like, look, there are trade-offs, and I'm a simplicity guy, and so I want to do this in the simplest way that works, even if it's not maybe as perfect as it would be, in your mind if we did it in SPS. I think we have to say that the reality of single-page applications on the ground is nowhere near as nice as a lot of single-page application advocates seem to think it is. I've used plenty of terrible single-page applications. So I think that's just something, especially more senior developers, is if they can, I don't want to make it a generational thing. I really do want to reach the younger kids, but I think there is this opportunity for more senior developers to say, hey, this is cool and this is a good idea. And yeah, it's easier, and yeah, it can't do everything necessarily quite as smoothly as React can in some theoretical situations or even some practical situations. So maybe we use React for that. But saying that in an organization, I think for senior developers is very good because it makes the younger developers okay with because younger developers there's always imposter syndrome. There's always, this terror of like, oh, I'm going to be found out. They're going to find out I'm not smart. And it's like, if some more senior people can say, hey, look, this is too crazy. This isn't where we're adding value in our application. We're adding it server side, or it's the interaction, it's the network effects of the app. So we're not going to dump a bunch of complexity into this part of our app. We're going to simplify this so we can use that complexity elsewhere. There's an essay I have up on htmx.org /essay. It's called Complexity Budget, where I talk about what a complexity budget is. Do you want to go through the chat? And I saw some questions sort of.
Yeah, let's
up there.
Let's dig through it.
The first one I saw was great tool. Question, yeah.
Great tool. The example with inline editing. Is it possible to trigger on clicking outside the form to cancel?
Yeah, good question. It is possible. It would be pretty sophisticated. You'd have to use scripting. And one thing that I want to clarify with HTMx is I'm not opposed to using scripting in web apps. I think scripting's great. I made a scripting language called HyperTalk, or HyperScript, excuse me, that's for scripting in web applications. So for something like that, a more advanced use case, you would need to do some scripting. You could do it in JavaScript, you could do it in HyperScript, you could do it in Alpine.js, whatever, pick your poison. Alpine.js has a really nice tool for this, and so does HyperScript. Vanilla.js would be a little trickier. You'd have to kind of roll your own. But what you would do is you would add some scripting that would trigger an event. You would have like clicked away, and you would be responsible for writing the scripting that made that clicked away event triggering, and you would put that on the cancel button. So you'd set up the listeners so that it then issued that cancel on that. So there's an essay on htmx.org/essays called Hypermedia Friendly Scripting, where I talk about how scripting works in a hypermedia driven application and sort of what that feels like. And so I would encourage you to read that if you're interested in the details on that.
How would you profile the limitations?
It's not as sophisticated as a single page application framework is going to be. You're not able to, because you're exchanging hypermedia, you've got this network request, and then you've got a chunk of HTML. Now there's tools that you've got in HTMx, more advanced tools, but it's very easy to, paint yourself into a corner with them if you get too crazy with them. And so, broadly, I would say try and keep things simple, make relatively large exchanges with the server. And that necessitates that that dictates that you're not going to be able to achieve the interactivity that you are with, like, for example, Vanilla.js, or maybe something like React in some cases. And so I think you have to look at what you're building and ask yourself, can this be built, or can maybe a simplified, maybe there's some compromises we're willing to make in our user experience in order to keep a more simple model, but we're still able to improve UX, but maybe not quite as much as we could with a more complicated model. You have to just make that trade-off. So I think that's one of the big ones. Another practical one is just, no one's heard of HTMx. That's changing pretty quickly. Fireship Dev did a profile of HTMx, which absolutely nuked the social media for stream. Do
you like this video?
Yeah, I thought it was good.
Cut a lot of stuff into it, but
yeah, crammed a lot into it. Didn't talk to me and got most. I think there wasn't anything that was wrong, and I think he hit the high spots. The guy's got 2.5 million subscribers, and I think there's been over 500,000 views of it. So that's a lot of people. So. So I think if you're trying to hire or build a team and you have people that are committed to React, if you're a developer and you're trying to just come into the industry, learn React, because that's what everyone's hiring for right now. I'm not going to tell you to learn HTMx because there's no HTMx job posts. So nothing succeeds like success, and right now React is that thing. And so maybe HTMx can be something that comes in on the side, internal tools, senior developers who have the ability to say, like, hey, maybe we should try this for part of our application. I think that's where you can bring it in. So I think those are the primary limitations. It's just a tool. There is a when to use hypermedia essay on the essays tab that you can read, where I sort of go over what my take is on when it's a good fit and when it isn't. It's not a good fit for everything, and that's fine. I'm not trying to present it as it is, but I think there's a lot of web apps that could be built using the hypermedia approach that are today not being built using it. So.
What I also like is that you start basically with this progressive enhancement mindset. You really focus on HTML first and hypermedia.
Yep.
And if you use HTMx, you just so to say sprinkle attributes to it. And if there might be situations where you come to some boundaries even with HTMx, but
Yep.
not sure where the boundaries are, but I'm sure the bigger it gets, there might be
Yeah.
some boundaries, right? But only then I would say, okay, then you might take a look into like, well, investigate again if even the other frameworks could solve this, right? But
Yeah.
like
All
I
big
see it as
software.
well, it's like it's a different from the different way, or it's starting from behind, so to say, nowadays quite
Yeah.
often that you front end is equal to React, equal Angular, whatever, right? And then you go until you come maybe to a situation where you need to like change HTML or tackle CSS, and then, whoa, okay, these are then you have some challenges there. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you know, boy, I think it's what I want to stress is it's a tool. There's a philosophy behind it. The original RESTful model. Again, go to the essays page if you're interested in the philosophy. There's a lot of stuff there that kind of explains what REST meant and how that all worked. And so, you know, more than convincing people to use HTMx, I want to just convince people to take another look at Hypermedia, because HTMx is, you know, it'll be here in 10, 20 years, maybe, who knows. But Hypermedia and the ideas of Hypermedia, I think, are a much more, you know, they're a more general concept and a more interesting idea.
Mm-hmm. This pretty much resonates with me as well. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad. Hopefully, have some fun. It is pretty fun. It's a different way of building stuff, so you got to get your head around it. But it should be fun, you know.
Mm-hmm. What else? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you briefly touched it already. I would say it's absolutely possible. Maybe not to some extent, but yeah.
Yeah, it depends. You know, the more event oriented a particular heavy JavaScript library is, the more events it emits, the better the interaction story with HTMX is going to be, and the less brutal it is to the DOM, the better. Because you know, when the DOM starts getting mutated out of band, that's when things can get a little bit tricky. But you know, we just saw sortable.js, and that integrates really cleanly. You know, I can't talk about a particular validation library, but there's no reason it shouldn't work. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is just the standard session cookie. So the way web apps have worked since time immemorial is you logged in on a logged in page and it set a cookie, a session ID cookie, and then that cookie was typically used on the server side to index into some store, either in memory or Redis or whatever, where the session information for that user, their email and so forth, were all kept. So it's funny because people who are used to front end development now, they think about like these crazy keys that you have to get and you have to keep in local storage or whatever. And the way it has just always worked in web development is just using session cookies. So it's kind of the old, I say like, oh, it's just the normal way, and everyone looks at me like I'm crazy, but it's the old way. Let's say it's the old way. And HTMX, you exchange cookies just like you do in a normal web request, and so the normal session management works for whatever server side stuff you're using.
Mm-hmm.
Your reason for upgrading makes a lot of sense, but even back to more declared. Yeah. In the background, yeah, there is still I mean, you know, I joke that like I had to write a lot of JavaScript to avoid writing JavaScript. So HTMX is JavaScript, and there's, unfortunately, for better or for worse, no way of getting around that. But I do think that HTMX takes that idea, takes that infrastructure, and repurposes it in favor of a declarative, hypermedia-oriented approach to building web applications. And so would I prefer that HTMX was part of the browser? Absolutely. Do I think HTMX should be HTML6? Yes, 100%. You know, like that would be awesome. I wouldn't have to do all this work. and so that would be good. So we're stuck where we are, and JavaScript's the thing that's there. So we're going to have to use it. And, you know, there are problems associated with it. But if you do adopt HTMX for your web development, one nice thing about that is that you end up writing a lot of HTML. And I've got You know, you're not going to write your backend in HTML. You're not going to write your domain logic in HTML. So what that means is that you're not going to be pressured into using a particular language on the server side. And that's in contrast with the situation with single page applications, where you've built this enormous front end library or application in JavaScript. And the question always becomes, how come we're not writing the backend in JavaScript as well? We can share domain logic and authenticate, you know, the validation logic and all that stuff. So when you adopt the single page application mindset, you're going to be pushed on the back end to adopt JavaScript. And so I don't, you know, I didn't like that. I like a diversity of server side and web frameworks in general. Like, I'm a programming language person, so I like lots of programming languages. And I think one philosophical goal of HTMx is, like, I want everyone to be able to do web development in whatever language they like. There's a lot of people that like Go. There's a lot of people that like Rust, Lisp, Haskell, you know, Python, obviously, you know, Java, C#, whatever it is. OCaml, there's a small but very enthusiastic OCaml community that's using HTMx. And I think that's great. I would prefer a web that's like that. The web was supposed to be open. It wasn't supposed to be a monolithic culture. It wasn't supposed to be everything in JavaScript or everything in anything, right? It was an open hypermedia-based system. And so early on, it was, you know, Perl scripts and PHP and so forth, CGI scripts and Bash, like all sorts of crazy stuff. And so that's what I would prefer. I think I like lots of different communities with their own little quirks and, you know, cultures. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Let's see. I think we have, say, 5 minutes or so. It's fine, right? So
Yeah.
Let's go over.
Yeah, I'm good.
Some more questions. I like the conversation. That's great. Yeah. Yes, PWA.
Yeah, I've not done any work with PWAs or with service workers. I gave service workers to someone else. There's service worker support in HyperScript, and I just didn't do it. I gave it to another person who knocked it out of the park, as far as I can tell. So I don't have a lot of experience with it. I know there are people who are interested in that, and there are people on the Discord, which you can get into if you want, at htmx.org/discord. That'll bounce you over to the server. There's a PWA channel that we just created because there are people talking about it. But unfortunately, I don't have enough experience to really talk about that competently at this point.
Okay. How about web components?
Yeah, with like standard the HTML standard web components, it works fine. And you could say, well, like, it's just exchanging HTML. So if you got components, the components work great. A lot of people want more like the JSX thing, and that's not HTMX's jam. You can use a JSX-like library on the server to generate your HTML if you want. But if you're looking for that client-side encapsulation that something like JSX gives you, like, you're not going to find that in HTMX.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
SSR.
So I would argue, if you did a CPU profile of the difference between generating the HTML for a response and generating the JSON for a response, it's going to be a round-off error. CPU burn is, you know, performance is going to be dominated by your database for almost every application out there. And so, you know, once you're accessing the database, CPU burn is just a round-off error. So, I mean, that's my answer to that. The actual difference between the two size-wise is just not significant. If string concatenation is your problem performance-wise, then you've got bigger fish to fry than HTMX versus React. But that's one of those whatabouts, you know, like, how do you answer it? Like, well, it's going to be more inefficient. Yeah, I mean, at some level, until you start looking at the actual JSON responses that are going back and how they're enormous because everything's being jammed into them to make it a general JSON API. Whereas with HTML, you can tune it for your particular screen and really get down to only the information that's necessary. So, you know, there are trade-offs. I'm not saying that HTML is a more efficient representation than JSON, you know, tuned and for a particular situation, because it's not. But from a practical standpoint, I don't think it makes as big a difference as most people think. And I think there's a lot of situations where, because of the nature of JSON, that responses can get really large with a lot of information that's unnecessary, in a way that HTML just doesn't have that issue, since it's so specific to a given screen.
How about regaining focus on an input field if the form is swept out after pressing enter?
Yep, that's one of the hard ones, for sure. Keeping focus and like video state, for example. So that's HTMx2 is, I'm hoping, going to be out at the end of the year. And there's a new feature in it called a morph swap, which is based, if anyone has ever seen Morphdom. Morphdom is an older library that morphs. It tries to preserve the DOM, and it changes the DOM from one DOM to another thing, but keeps as many elements in the original as possible. And so I've got an updated algorithm called idiomorph, which is sort of I tried to take Morphdom and add a little bit of functionality to it to make it a little smarter in how it does merging. And that's going to be in HTMx 2.0. And it's available now as a plugin. There's an extensions mechanism for HTMx, so you can download it and start using it with HTMx today. And that addresses that problem of like, okay, as I'm typing, things need to get updated. But the story right now for that isn't great. So if you look at, there's an example of validation, form validation in the examples page. And what we do there is we actually target, when you're typing into an email into an input, we target the thing after it, the label after it, so that we're not replacing the thing that the user is typing into. Instead, we're taking the results and putting them somewhere else. So those are just that's the compromise of using the hypermedia model right now.
Okay. What else? Any tips on catching unexpected errors?
Yeah,
Error handling.
HTMx has a really extensive event mechanism, and so there's events for almost everything that occurs. And so that's another example of where you should start writing some client-side scripting, but hypermedia oriented scripting, where you're handling events and doing things in the UI. Again, I don't want to come across as anti-JavaScript or anti-scripting. I just, there's a certain way I advocate doing it. It's capturing events and responding to them. And so HTMx tries to, just like it is able to respond to other events, it tries to be liberal in the number of events that it emits, and so that you can know, like, in this situation, do this. You can know when something happens, so you can, for example, show a pop-up or flash some sort of growl message or whatever.
Yes.
If you go to htmx.org/talk, I think there's a bunch of and then you can search for HTMx on YouTube as well. But I think the essays, and then the book, which is at hypermedia.systems, is also good if you really want to take some time and get deep or deeper. Might be a little basic for some people that have been around for a while, but I think it's a good refresher.
Absolutely, I can totally confirm this. I think at 90% reading it. It's great. It's
good. I'm really glad to hear that.
It's really helpful for all levels, I would say. I would even recommend it to maybe junior developers, right? As it contains a refresher or an explainer on hypermedia in general, which is often lost nowadays, right?
Yeah, that's who I wrote it to. I wrote it to younger developers, younger
perfect.
web developers.
I felt younger after reading it.
Yeah, I wish I felt younger, man. Holy smokes! After this plane ride, I'm like, I feel like I aged 2 decades. Oh.
Okay, so let's see. I think these were all the questions, and we are almost over 1 hour, so I don't want to stretch your presence at the airport too much longer, right?
Yeah, it finally got quiet, and now it's time to get out of here. But I appreciate that. Thanks a bunch for having me on. And I'm on Twitter. You can follow htmx_org, and you can check out. You can always hit me up on Twitter or whatever. And we have a Discord, and look for that book, and we'll hopefully have that out late next week.
Cool. I'm one of the first ones who buys the book. I'm sure.
Perfect.
I appreciate really like paper books, right?
This one's
a bit nostalgic here.
Yeah, it's a paper book. It's hardcover. We're only doing like the primo version because we figure it's online for free anyways. So if you really want the book, you can get the hard copy version. We have a nice cover, so.
Cool. Cool. Okay.
All right.
Cool. Lots of praise and applause.
Yeah, I appreciate that, everybody. I hope you're having fun. I hope everyone's having fun. Be cool. You know, again, it's just a tool. It's a good tool, but it's just a tool. So we're all having fun, right?
Okay, cool. Then I would say enjoy the rest of the evening or the
Thank
day,
you.
right? It's already late afternoon, I think. So cool.
Okay.
And thanks for being with us.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Thank you. Appreciate it, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.
See you.